Welcome to the Transform Podcast. I'm Jackson Lowry. I'm usually behind the camera, but sadly Andrew was sick this week, so we weren't able to kick off. I'm joined this week by PJ, our pastor at the Renewal Campus. We're going to be continuing the series, Aren't All Religions the Same? Last week we did Islam, which was a very interesting conversation for sure. But this time we're going to be getting into Hinduism as well as Buddhism, which is definitely going to be a tough topic for us, but I think that we definitely have some good stuff to talk about here. So to kick off this week, I think we're going to start with Hinduism. And I think we should start with just kind of the history. So if you could just kind of enlighten me a little bit, PJ, about kind of what we know about Hinduism's kind of founding and just kind of go from there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we should caveat, you already hinted at this. These Eastern religions are really hard for Westerners to conceptualize. So even we probably don't give I know we won't give the best presentation of this. If you really want to know all the ins and outs, talk to somebody who is a Buddhist, who is a Hindu, who studies this more. And I think there's a temptation as Westerners too to look at these and just say, oh, that's weird. So we want to give them respect and honor, but also talk about them in a fair way. So Hinduism is really unique in that I think most scholars would say it's one of the oldest religions. It's hard to date exactly. It's kind of a confluence of many people in the modern area of India. And even the word Hindu in India come from the exact same word. So if you take the word Hindu, Hindu, when the Greeks kind of came to that region, H is not a letter in the Greek alphabet. It's not a sound that they like to make. So they drop the H from the beginning. So you have Hindu, and then Greeks love Ia endings. And so you take out the U, add Ia, Hindu becomes India. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's really cool. The faith and the region are so tied together, which is why if you look at modern day Hinduism, it's some crazy 90% are all still in India.
Yeah.
It's kind of one and the same in a lot of ways. But it's an extremely old faith that, again, has a confluence of a lot of different beliefs and practices that have kind of come together to form what we know as Hinduism. Like all religions, like all faith groups, it's diverse. And so even when you talk about Hinduism, you might say something that applies to most, but not all. And so there's a great deal of diversity within it. But that's just kind of where it comes from. And that's why you see it mostly still in India and not so much beyond that.
Yeah, and so kind of like what you were just saying is, any kind of religion, including Christianity, when it spans so many people, you're going to have a bit of a diversity. So we are talking in broad strokes when we're getting into kind of the core tenets and the kind of doctrine. But that does lead us into, can you kind of tell me a little bit more about kind of the basic levels of what Hinduism is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in general, whenever I think of Hinduism, when I talk to people about Hinduism, one of the key ideas is oneness. And so sometimes even from non-Hindus, this will kind of come into their thinking, this idea that everything is one.
Yeah.
It's kind of a key idea, key term in Hinduism. And so kind of one of the base tenets of Hinduism is that there's kind of one universal soul named Brahman, and it's the source of all reality. And so you and I are one, all matter is one, there's not soul and body separate. Everything is kind of one thing. Again, this is where, as Westerners, it's hard to even wrap our heads around. Somebody once described it as kind of like an ocean, and we're all just kind of drops in that ocean, where for a bit we kind of pop out, but we're still part of it, and then we kind of return to the ocean.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of our life. So everything is one. Brahman is a huge deal. Yeah.
So there's less of kind of the spiritual and physical distinction that you find in a lot of other religions.
Correct. Yeah.
Gotcha.
They're just kind of different manifestations of the same oneness.
Gotcha.
Which again, to us, it's hard to conceptualize, but that's kind of the basic tenet of that. Beyond that then, so they would say each of us has kind of this eternal soul that is part of the Brahman, that's part of this kind of oneness. And then that soul continues in cycles. And so you have this thing called karma, something we're very familiar with that's made it into popular culture, language. And so we typically think of karma as, you do something good, good things will happen to you. Kind of like a system, and it kind of operates that way, but for them they'd say that your soul, while it's kind of separated from Brahman in an extent, has this karma. So your actions in your present life are going to determine your future life, and your actions in your past life determine your present circumstances. So if you were good in a previous life, you're going to be born into situations where things are good for you now. But likewise, if you live this life poorly, apart from how you should, when you're reborn, you're going to come back in less than ideal circumstances. And so with that, that's gets to the idea of rebirth. So this soul is eternal, and so when you die, it takes a new form, a new body, a new life that is determined by that karma. So it's
you're still in the ocean.
Yes, you're still in the ocean, exactly. So you're still part of it. It's just a different manifestation, but it's determined on how well you lived according to how you were supposed to.
Yeah. And so that does kind of, I know we're jumping the gun a little bit here in our notes, but
go.
What you brought up does kind of bring us into kind of caste system.
Yeah.
Because for anyone listening, I am not a religious expert. I'm normally behind the camera, so I'm doing my best. But a lot, I have seen kind of claims that Hinduism does kind of reinforce the caste system because, like you brought up, if you're reincarnated into kind of a bad situation, there is generally a thought that, well, you did something in your past life, your soul self did something that put you in this situation. So there's kind of this idea that those in poverty or those in those lower castes, they're there kind of for a reason.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And just for those who aren't familiar with kind of the whole setup, the caste system that exists, and you're exactly right that this is where the culture, the society, and the faith kind of are also intertwined. It's kind of like a pyramid of sorts, where you have at the top, you have the priestly, they're called the Brahmins. Next you have warriors, fighters. I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sorry. Hindu words are tough for an English speaker like me, but you have the Kshatriyas. Then you have kind of traders, merchants, the Vaishyas, and then you have the laborers at kind of the bottom rung that are the Shudras. And then actually beyond the pyramid, kind of outside of that, you have the untouchables, those who work with meat, who clean up trash. And you're exactly right. There's a big theme that where you're born in that pyramid is determined in part, a big part of how you lived your previous life. And so it's kind of like, you deserve this. This is kind of what you get. And so what it would encourage one to do then is to say, okay, I'm in this part of the caste. I need to live according to how I should live in that part. And if I do that well, maybe when I come back, I'll be in a better part of the caste system. I've seen some things that suggest that at the beginning or early on, the religious text would suggest that the caste wasn't so rigid, that you kind of were placed based off of what skills you had been given. But the way it's definitely manifested is kind of what caste you're born into. For the most part, modern society has changed this a little bit. It's kind of where you stay for your whole life.
And that's kind of like you said, where the kind of culture and religion and the government kind of all meet in India here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating.
There's a lot of layers there, especially with the caste system. But you did just bring up you brought up kind of some history with some interpretations of the holy books. That does kind of lead into my next question, which is, can you tell me a little bit more about the holy books and kind of the God structure, at least from what we here understand about Hinduism?
Yeah, so the main religious texts that they have are called the Vedas, the four Vedas. They believe that these are divinely inspired texts. They're really, it's somewhat similar to the Bible in that you have like songs, you have kind of more explanation. And then you also have a few texts that help interpret those, like the, again, I apologize for pronunciation, Upanishads, which are meant to be kind of, all right, we have these texts, but what do they actually mean? So it's kind of an interpretation of them. And then you have other ones, probably the most notable being the Gita, which takes place on the battlefield, and it's this conversation about how to live life, and that's a very influential one. You have these texts, the Vedas being kind of the basis, but these other ones having big influence. And they cover a lot, and they kind of set up some of the gods and how to live. The gods are a very unique setup there too, in that, again, we've come from, as Christians, monotheism, where there's one God. We talked about Islam last time. There's one God. Judaism, one God. But Hinduism has space for a lot of gods. And there's kind of a huge range and all sorts of different ones. There are three big ones, though, kind of considered the Hindu Trinity. There's Brahma, that's the creator of the universe. He's not Brahman. He's not the universe itself, but he's the one who created it.
Gotcha.
Then you have Vishnu, who's the preserver, and then Shiva, the destroyer. And Hindus see kind of all of time as this big cycle. It just continues to go in this pattern. And so it kind of makes sense. You have kind of this creation, preservation, and destruction that goes on. And there's kind of four eras within that. And so I think modern Hindus would say that we're in the final stage before destruction. Human morality and stuff has gone so wrong that Shiva will destroy everything and it'll be recreated again. But those three kind of help create this balance in the universe.
Gotcha.
Creation, preservation, destruction. And so they're kind of the big ones, although there are, like I said, multiple other gods that do exist.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Which kind of leads me to one of my other kind of the central question. Now that we have kind of a good background of what we're talking about, obviously there's still a lot of nuance and stuff that we can't discuss in a 30-minute podcast.
Yeah.
But we got to get into the actual question, which is, aren't all religions basically the same? Hinduism is one of the easier ones as far as, obviously it's not monotheistic. There's a lot of more clear differences than with Islam or Judaism. But yeah, I think if we can just kind of start to dig into kind of on a base level, what's the big differences here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, first off, I think you're spot on that, there's some big, as Westerners, red flags where we say, monotheism, God is one. Clearly that's not there. I think that what's interesting about Hinduism too is there's this big understanding of what's called dharma, and it's living your life according to, again, what your caste is, who you were made to be, and it's that living according to your dharma that gets you karma and all of that. But as part of that, they would say that there's many paths to the gods, to God, to the oneness, and so sometimes people in Hinduism will use the image of kind of trails up a mountain that can reach the top, and so Hinduism in a way can be a very tolerant faith in that they might even look at a Christian and say, hey, that's great that you have your path. Jesus, cool, he can be one of the gods. And so in some ways it can be enticing for Westerners or people who really want to be tolerant, but like you highlighted, there's some clear contradictions with the Christian faith. First and foremost being that Jesus says, I'm the way. And so if faith in anything but Jesus clearly is an issue.
There's just the one trail going up the mountain.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There aren't all these other paths. We would say those are all dead ends, that there's one who has come down and that's the path. And so clearly we push back on that and say, no, it reminds us that there's one truth. His name is Jesus, and that we hold to that. And I mean, obviously we talked about there's a lot of gods that we wouldn't place in there. What's interesting about the caste system, which you talked about, like previous life karma, there's a scene where Jesus and his disciples are walking. They see a blind man, and his disciples asked Jesus, that is, who sinned, this man or his father or his parents? Basically, all right, so clearly if things are going bad for this man, it's either his fault or his ancestors' fault. So there's kind of this guilt association, you get what you deserve. And Jesus says it's neither, but actually says that this is, helping him show that he is the Son of God, and he's answering all these questions about sin. But what's really powerful about it is it highlights we live in a broken world, and your circumstances are not completely just your own doing. It's not like, oh, in your past life you screwed up. Sometimes tragedy happens, right? Sometimes the good die young,
No, it's definitely a totally different way of viewing suffering.
Yes.
And kind of like we talked about is it does feel like there and obviously it gets so mixed with the government and everything else, but it does feel like with Hinduism there can be kind of the lack of grace element where the baseline assumption is you kind of deserve whatever's happening to you, where where the Christian perspective would be much more, like you said, sometimes this is just a fallen world, and so like you said, and a lot of time, and you look at the challenges as something that is preparing you for a higher level of of glory and righteousness. So it's a totally different way of viewing things. So I definitely think that's a big thing. And like you said, kind of the example of who, as kind of a fan of history, I think it's kind of underappreciated too, how often Jesus was spending time with undesirable people all the time, right? And so this is definitely, and again, a very far-flung thing from Hinduism, where you would not see people from higher caste mixing with the untouchable, undesirable people. You're not going to see marriages between these castes. That's not going to happen, whereas Jesus is saying, I'm going to be in the midst of the people who need me the most, and those are the broken people. Those are the people who are making these mistakes. So I definitely think that's a huge difference there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you hit on that, because that is so true. You think of the people he often criticized, it was those in like the priestly class who were trying to maintain this level of separation, and he kind of flattened it and said, no, you're all, all fallen humans, all sinful, but I've come for you all.
Yeah.
And so he kind of tore down some of those arbitrary human traditions that were trying to keep power and push those untouchables to the side.
So I did want to kind of touch on for a second avatars in Hinduism. If you can kind of tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's the term that people probably know if you watch the old cartoon Avatar, The Last Airbender, even the Avatar movies that have come out. So an avatar is basically one of the gods who has come to Earth and taken some sort of form to intervene in some way. And so there's like a legend about the Earth getting swallowed by the oceans, and I forgot which god takes the form of some animal as an avatar to come down and pull the land out of the water again.
Gotcha.
And so avatars are really this manifestation of a god on Earth in some sort of form, which kind of makes sense when you think of how we use avatar now. If you have like social media avatar, it's some sort of form of you in that space that isn't you, but it is, you're acting through it. You think of the movie Avatar by James Cameron. Originally, he is a man, spoiler for this movie, who goes into this machine and he is acting in this body that is not his own, but it really is him acting. So that's kind of where that idea comes from.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea behind avatars. So there's all sorts of avatars. Every god has their avatars that they've used in different stories. And he's not an avatar, but then probably one of the most recognizable symbols of Hinduism is Ganesha, who is this elephant-headed god. And so it's actually the son, I think, of Shiva. Yeah, so the destroyer god has this son, Ganesha, who actually has a human head, but then Shiva cuts it off and he has to make do with the elephant head. But it's a very important god because it's kind of the descendant of the destroyer god. Ganesha is a god of removing obstacles, which is why a lot of Hindus worship Ganesha. You'll see elephant-headed statues where they put different oils and stuff on and touch, and it's a way of asking Ganesha to help remove obstacles in your life. So yeah, those are some of the kind of pop culture things that we might see, and that's kind of some backstory of where those come from.
For sure. Yeah, and I just kind of just an interesting follow-up question would, because there's other religions have interesting interpretations of who Jesus was. Yeah. So kind of by that definition would in kind of if like you said, a very tolerant Hindu were to add Jesus into their pantheon of gods, which a lot of through all of history, a lot of pantheistic religions have taken on Jesus as just another member of the list of gods, would they say that's an avatar then?
That's a really good question. Well, I didn't expect to go here, but there was a Christian at one point in the early church named Apollinarian.
Yeah.
And he supposed that Jesus was like the divine Son of God who existed in a human body, but was not a human. So this is sometimes called like spacesuit Christology or a spacesuit understanding of Jesus. Like, you can just imagine like God coming into a human body and kind of looking around through these eyes.
Yeah.
Now eventually the church was like, no, the Word became flesh. He actually was human. So it's interesting, even in the Christian tradition, we've had there has at least been this idea that's popped up of who Jesus is and kind of taking him in almost an avatar role where he's kind of occupying this, but it's not really him. But yeah, there is, I think, I don't know exactly. I'd have to ask like a Hindu who would accept Jesus into the pantheon. But I would guess that it could be that. They'd either take him as a god, a lesser god, obviously, because you have kind of your big three.
Yeah.
Or maybe they would just take him to be the form that one god had taken at one point to try and correct some things. I'm not sure. I'd have to ask, but that's a pretty fascinating question to think about.
Well, there's it's the doctrinal questions can really get us in a rabbit hole.
Yes, of
course. But to continue on, to kind of there's kind of through this conversation, if you've been paying attention, you can kind of tell there's a lot of aspects of Hinduism and kind of spirituality that have made their way into our culture. Obviously, they've been kind of westernized and stuff. But I think that we had a couple extra things on here that we kind of wanted to get to where, like you said, that help us kind of refine our own faith and our own doctrine of kind of looking at some more of these differences.
Exactly. So a couple things I just wanted to highlight when you think about Hinduism. So first off, we talked about this eternal soul. And so Hindus would say that you are your soul. You're not your body, you're not your mind, you're not your ego. And that's a great philosophy question that people always ask, what are you? Hindus would say you're the soul. And Christians are tempted to think like that. We often think, I'm just a soul. I die, the real me, my soul goes to heaven, and that's it. But the Christian truth has always been that we are body and soul. From the very beginning, God formed dirt into the first man and breathed this breath of life into him. And so right there, you have this body, you have this soul. That theme continues, and that's why for the New Testament, it's such a big theme of the resurrection, that death is this terrible separation of body and soul for a time. You die, your soul is at rest, but we look forward to the resurrection when the body raises too, and we're kind of fully human again.
Yeah.
So sometimes we hear that, like, you are your soul, and we're like, oh yeah, but it's not the full story, and that's why it's kind of helpful as Christians to kind of reflect on, that's not quite the full story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just the ocean. You're not it's
exactly.
Not,
yes.
Yeah.
100%. And that brings up a good point too, that we are individuals too.
Yeah.
We share a common humanity. We are creatures like all of creation. We are made in God's image, but we are not God. We are not part of God. We are separate. He is a whole separate being beyond our comprehension. And so, there's more place for an individuality within the Christian faith than Hinduism would probably take.
Yeah, a lot more distinction over the individual and the individual's both body and spirit.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say too, so a big theme of Hinduism is dharma, living according to your dharma, whatever skills you have. Well, we would, again, not take a Hindu worldview. It is interesting because I think Christians can at least, it's a good, worthy reflection, because as Christians, we believe, if you are a daughter, part of how God wants you to live is to live as a good daughter.
Yeah.
If you have been gifted and you find yourself as a teacher, you want to be a good teacher. One time Martin Luther was asked what it means to be a Christian shoemaker, and he said, a shoemaker who makes decent shoes and sells them at a fair price. Like, to do well what you've been given.
Yeah.
And so I would never use the word dharma in like a Christian context, but there is a sense of what has God given you, what abilities, what responsibilities, what people in your life, and part of your worship towards him is to do that well.
Yeah, kind of fulfill your duty.
Exactly. Yeah. What stations are you placed in? Do that well, and don't neglect those. So there is a little bit of truth in that concept that, I'm not gifted in certain areas, and if I had this dream, like I want to be a great football player, and that's not my gift, and that would not be honoring to God to waste my time pursuing that. It's not that you can't play football, but if I neglected my family, neglected doing the work of God in other areas so I could pursue this dream just for my own sake, my own selfishness, that would be bad. But instead looking at what God has given me, how can I serve the world around me, serve my community, serve my family?
Yeah.
That's the better question. And that's kind of in line with some of the ideas of Dharma. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Great. Anything else that we wanted to talk about before we finish up here, PJ?
I think that covers most of it. Again, Hinduism is vast, it's diverse, there's so much more.
For sure.
But that definitely covers kind of the major swaths of it and kind of a Christian take on it. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we will be picking up with Buddhism and continuing this topic. And after Buddhism, we're hopefully going to be looking into getting into some of the kind of non-mainstream Christian sects as well as some other religions. So this will be continuing for a while. But please feel free to write in at hello@sjdenver.org if you have any questions you want to ask us. But otherwise, we will see you next time. Bye-bye.